SECfans.com. Week 5 is here, and stepping out of the SEC for our first game, Penn State and Ohio State. We always do one. This week we're doing two because we're also going to hit up Notre Dame and Stanford. The SEC slate this week is kind of bad, y'all. Ohio State fans already know about us. We got a lot of Ohio State subscribers, which should tell you, Penn State fans, that we're pretty objective. We're not here to talk trash, not SEC versus Big Ten trash talk. We're here to get nerdy about your game. We are a data-driven channel, so any position we make, we try to back it up with data, observations from the field. No homer trash talk here, so that means you can go ahead and subscribe. We talk every week about games outside the SEC, and I think if you give us a chance, I guarantee you by the end of this video, you're going to be like, man, those guys were pretty objective. I don't like that they didn't pick my team, or did. So I'm going to go ahead and subscribe because I want to listen to him next week. All right, y'all. We had a live show last week just for a little bit of housekeeping. If you want to listen to 2 hours of really good discussion, it is a little SEC focused. Feel free to hit that one up. It's also on our website. We posted the audio only version of it. Do know we had a lot of technical issues. That was our first live show, and we're going to iron those out before the next live show. All right, Josh, let's talk about this game. It was a long open to get into what is obviously the game of the week in college football. We've been looking at this one since week 1. We had a good feeling both of these teams coming into this would be undefeated. Penn State and Ohio State, are you concerned if you are a Penn State or Ohio State fan in this game that your defenses haven't looked great so far? And when I say that, so I'm talking here to my co-host Josh, we both judge teams fairly critically. So you might think that we're coming off a little negative. It's because when we're talking about teams that are playoff contenders, we have to be overly critical. All playoff contenders look great, so we got to find the next level down of what's going on. So Penn State gave up 24 this weekend. Ohio State gave up, I think it was 28 to TCU. Again, long-winded open to get to this question. Are you concerned that you have some problems on defense, or is this a situation where they were playing teams beneath them, working on some stuff, and now we're in a prime time?
With both teams, I think you have to be at least a little bit concerned with the fact that they've given up points against decently good offenses, and I do kind of push the fact that that's probably true for both teams. Now, obviously, Penn State, arguably the more concerning there. Penn State, in the game against Illinois, they did pull away, they did win the game, but at the end of the third quarter, that game was Penn State 28, Illinois 24. That was not by any means a real blowout. That was a game that Illinois just sort of fell flat on their face and it ran away from them in the fourth quarter. I think you have to be seriously concerned that Illinois was able to do that because Illinois, I think everyone would admit, is not a particularly good team this year. They have not offensively been very successful. 24 points is more points than they were able to put up against South Florida the week prior. And if you were to look at yards per play, we're not going to get into it too much. We have a sort of a primer on our model, and that gets into a little more why we use the numbers we do. But Penn State, Illinois got about as many yards per play against Penn State as Illinois got against Western Illinois on September 8th, and that was about 5.4 yards per play in both games. Illinois really had a harder time moving the ball in South Florida than they did Kent State. All that stuff is really bad signs, right? Penn State defensively is not a great football team right now, really on either side of the football. They're better against the pass than they are against the run, but that also is probably very much a sort of byproduct of who they've played, and that is where Penn State is. I think the harder thing to pick up on is the fact that Ohio State, maybe is struggling a little more defensively than we had thought. Yeah, I think, if you followed us and you saw our model, we had Ohio State winning by a significant margin against TCU. That game was maybe a little closer than we thought, but it wasn't necessarily out of the realm of what we expected. But, our expectations were where we thought Ohio State were pretty high. And I think something that's important to understand when you hear about our evaluation is when TCU scored more than we anticipated, that made us have to lower our estimation, or made me lower my estimation of where Ohio State's defense was. There were some things we pointed out. We pointed out in the show. There was a lot of back and forth. A lot of people said we were kind of crazy, but Ohio State gave up a lot of big chunk plays. against TCU, and they had done it against Oregon State. We flagged it as a potential problem, trying to determine what the issues would be against TCU. People said, well, their starting safety's out. There was a rain delay. It was late in the game. But with all those things, it turns out that really wasn't, for lack of a better term, that wasn't sort of an aberration. That was something that maybe Ohio State had an issue with, and it's sort of shown up. And now I think something that was also a little concerning, if you want to follow Ohio State, is TCU may not be a great team, right? The fact that TCU struggled so badly with Texas, they only put up 16 points in that game. All of a sudden, that TCU Ohio State game where they put up 28, that looks a lot worse. So the first thing I want to point out with all of this is there's a lot of negative statistical indicators. Now, I think these are both pretty good teams. There's a lot of garbage time in here. There's just a ton of junk data that's going to lead to some weird results we're going to have to talk about later. But as far as our model is concerned, which is as blind as we can make it to everything else, it doesn't care about what the name of your team is. It's just saying this is what your team is. This is how they perform. This is how they looked against their opponents. Play it all off. It's, relationally, again, you can look at the video to understand kind of how that works. Right now, there's a lot of negative signs for both defenses.
If you're looking at Penn State, if we're talking about matchups, though, I think some of the issue with Ohio State was big, long, explosive plays, because what we talked about was some observations we had with both poor safety and poor linebacker play, specifically as it related to over pursuit and bad angles, giving up home runs to super fast running backs. Miles Sanders is a good running back for Penn State. He is not a speed burner. He is a 4.57, 4.59 kind of guy. He's not this guy you can't tackle in a phone booth that's going to run, a 4.37 at a combine. So does that help sort of mitigate some of the places where Ohio State has been stung by an opposing offense this year and maybe help bring their defensive numbers back to reality?
I think it does. I mean, there's no Saquon Barkley on this team right now. Nobody that's going to sort of pick the team up and carry them. And like you said, a lot of the problem for Ohio State, people talk about angles. This is kind of why I wasn't so quick to throw away that point. Linebackers are responsible for making tackles too, right? And the fact that Ohio State had issues, it's really easy to say, oh, the starting safety's out. That's what it was. But guys get around the linebackers, they get around other guys. That's an issue with speed. That's an issue with the team to at least a certain degree. I don't see the kind of guys on Penn State's roster that are going to be able to just outrun Ohio State's linebackers, right? I mean, when you're playing a team like TCU that has, at the skill positions, tremendous speed, and they can get on the edges of the perimeter, they just run by their linebackers. And I'm gonna bring up an SEC point here, just from our frame of reference. We're both watching the Texas-Alabama game, and there was a play where Kellen Mond, the quarterback for Texas A&M, took off running and had a huge play against Alabama. But the thing that both of us noticed that was kind of amazing is he actually outran Alabama's corner on the play. That's what speed does. The linebackers in the game, and I think the announcers were talking about spying or whatever. When you're that fast, there's certain positions like linebacker where if you're out of position to start with and you don't have the guy, he's gone. You can't do anything. You can't catch up. Ohio State's linebackers have had issues with having proper gap alignment. But like you're talking about, even if he has a situation where there's a blown gap and he can have a big play, the potential of that is a lot more limited because once he gets into space, he's likely to be run down. And even if he has a poor angle from the linebackers can catch that up and make something happen. It's the same sort of issue you see a lot in the NFL, why certain backs are more successful in the NFL than others, and why so many teams go with a really fast back. And it's when the linebackers are able to catch you, it really limits your ability to have a big play.
And it's sort of the concept, if you're thinking about how you can actually put points on the board against an elite team, you have to, it's not cheating to get a 93-yard touchdown run. It's not cheating to get however long the Oregon State run was, but it's saying that if you don't have that guy, that's going to score from way outside the red zone, you may not get any points at all because you might get a 20, 30-yard chunk play, but these defenses, even when they have issues, are so hard to consistently drive the field that if you can't sneak in a chunk play touchdown here or there, you may go from, say, 30 points to 10 points.
I mean, it all kind of compounds. And I think something that's kind of interesting in general, if we're on the same sort of vein, is the odd situation and the receiving core for for Penn State. So last year, Penn State's leading receiver is Deshaun Hamilton, right? And Saquon Barkley is a close third, right smack on the other side of Juwan Johnson. So they have three targets. They have Hamilton, who's a 6'1", 206 guy. Juwan Johnson, who's huge, 6'4", 226. And then you got Saquon Barkley, who's a special player in general, but 5'11", 230. Now, we were really, really high on Saquon Barkley. Right. We did a video at the end of the year where we asked where he would be in the SEC, and I think we ended up concluded that we both felt like he was probably better than any of the backs the SEC had last year, which was obviously fair, but just to make the point that we're not being homers on any of this. If you looked at those three guys, what you had is you had a prototypical build in Hamilton for what you want in a receiver, that 6'1", sort of 210 range. Johnson is a typical possession receiver. Once you get over 6'2", it kind of gets harder to be agile. And especially once you get over 220 pounds, he's a big guy. It's like 6'4", 230, almost a tight end. And it really just in build. Saquon Barkley, of course, was a back that could really, like you said, it was explosive offensively in a way that, maybe Sanders isn't. If you go look at their targets now, all of a sudden their leading receiver is KJ Hamler. Hamler is 5'9", 173. And then Juwan Johnson's still second at 6'4", 225. And you got to work down to find Brandon Polk, who's 5'9", 179. Point being, of your leading receivers, two of the three are under 180 pounds. The next most targeted guy is Holland, the tight end, and it starts dropping off at that point, right? So, point being, everybody, really all four starting receivers, Hamler, Polk, Tompkins, they're all sub 6 foot. And really only Johnson's the guy bigger than that. But as I said, again, honestly, he's almost arguably a tight end. And I know a lot of people would say, well, he's a receiver. He's not a tight end. I get that. But his build is more like a tight end. None of those guys, point being, none of those guys are middle of the field passing targets. None of those guys are linebacker targets. It changes the way that Penn State has to operate offensively. I think one of the curiosities to get turned back around and why I bring this up, Penn State has a lot of guys that are sort of scat players, small players that you want to get the ball in space and let them run. It's kind of going to be interesting to see how they handle that because on one hand, Ohio State showed a propensity to give up bad angles. So if you want to use those guys in a short passing game or jet sweeps or what have you, maybe there's something there. But the other hand, I don't know how well they're going to be able to make Ohio State really respect a traditional passing game. And with McSorley, they've been usually a deep threat offense. I think a lot of the reason why they haven't been such a quick strike, deep threat offense this year is the fact that Penn State lacks the proper receivers to do so. They end up being a lot more like what we saw last year in the SEC with Mississippi State, which at times was a pretty good offense, but they never really had the correct pieces at receiver. So everything was kind of piecemeal.
I'm glad you brought up Trace McSorley. Obviously, we're going to talk about the quarterbacks in this game. You and I are both pretty high on Haskins. I think after the TCU game, I came away higher on Haskins than you were. I think it maybe took a step back for you. But we both think in this offense, it's something that Ohio State has been missing. Would you say that Trace McSorley, even though Sean Robinson had a good game against TCU and TCU overall, or for TCU against Ohio State, and they had a good game in general against Ohio State, would you say Trace McSorley is a far more potent, lethal weapon for this Ohio State defense to face than Sean Robinson from TCU?
I would say so. I think McSorley has pretty exceptional skills in certain areas. Now, he's not a perfect player, right? I mean, I think you'd agree with that. He has certain things he's good at, certain things he's not good at. If you want to focus on his positives, Obviously, his deep ball is one of the best in college football. The guy can put the ball in the money. He's pretty fearless throwing the ball down the field. The negatives are things like completion percentage. He's only completing about under 54% of his throws, about 53.8%. His yards per attempt average isn't that high. It's 7.2 yards per attempt, and that's really due to the fact that this year I think their traditional passing game is a little limited. Now, something I kind of want to bring out about that and why it's, probably a lot of Penn State fans might take umbrage with my point, kind of picking on the receivers. One, we are picking on things because both teams have played a lot of inferior competition. So when we talk about this a lot, and I think Ohio State fans have heard enough from us that they kind of understand where we're coming from now, little small details or things that seem like not really an issue, but they were kind of a problem, like the Oregon State deep, propensity to give up long plays thing with Ohio State. Those things become much bigger issues when you play better teams. So looking at McSorley, I'll give sort of an objective data point relative to himself. 2016, McSorley was throwing for 9.3, threw on the season for 9.3 yards per attempt. 2017, he threw on the season for 8.4 yards per attempt. This year, he's throwing for 7.2 yards per attempt. So over the past 3 years, where he's been a full-time starter, his yard per attempt average has dropped about a yard a year. I don't think McSorley has become a worse quarterback every year. So what I have to look for is to find the problem, if you want to call it that. And to me, the reason there's been a decline, it's not McSorley, it's the receiving threats. Without the guys they had, Deshaun, or without Saquon Barkley, certainly, I don't think they have the same deep passing game they had. And as good as he is in the deep ball, this is why I keep throwing this caveat out. I started there and I hammered it. A lot of what McSorley is and this deep passing attack is, and a lot of questions we have, I think are going to be significantly limited by the receiving core that Penn State's fielding, because that's going to, right so far, I think that's really hamstrung their offense. And let me note, his yard per attempt average is a yard lower than it was last year, and that's having faced, to this point, honestly, pretty darn weak competition.
So I'm really high on Trace McSorley. I like him a lot. Tell me though what you think, and we don't do a whole lot of like gut or emotion discussion on this channel. We do acknowledge home field advantage, which is a big deal in Beaver Stadium. It's actually a really tough place to play. It's an SEC like atmosphere. It's I know like a lot of SEC fans take pride in their home fields, but it's like that. Washington is another place that's real tough to play. Anyway, McSorley is one of these like gritty, emotional guys, and in a lot of ways, it works for close games or big games when you're in it. But do you think sometimes emotional guys and teams that feed off of emotional quarterbacks have the propensity or the chance that they might crash that much harder if things start going sideways?
I think there's always the potential for it. And it's been interesting to see. I think Penn State sort of slowed this down a lot without Moorhead, but the offense that they've run in the past, and I have to assume that's kind of what they're going to follow in a bigger game until we kind of see otherwise what it looks like. That style of offense where you want to be very aggressive, you want to throw down the field, you do a lot of what are honestly low percentage plays, and then there's a lot of other stuff they did under, try to keeping teams honest. That offense can go bang, bang, score quick, and it can also go 3 and out really quick. And like you talked about emotionally, really the past few years, Penn State's been very successful in hitting those plays when they needed them, and they've gotten an emotional high on it, and things have gone really well. But, that doesn't happen every week. And then sometimes you're going to have a situation at Penn State where, things don't go your way, where you don't hit those plays, you turn the ball over a lot, all of a sudden you're down 21 points and you're in a hole, and things get rough. So, yeah, I do agree with your point here. I think we're kind of on the same page to a certain degree. That 2016 Michigan game, the 10-49 game that they lost, that game, I'm not saying this is going to be the result here, but that is the danger in this offense when it doesn't function well. Things can snowball very quickly, and emotionally, when you get behind, you start feeling desperate, and then you start taking chances you shouldn't take. it's just it can be problematic when you don't run honestly a more conservative offense where you just kind of want to keep banging away and doing your thing. You when you run Penn State style of offense, you tend to die by the sword, or you win by the sword or you die by the sword, right? I mean, when it doesn't work, you can get behind just as fast as in most games you end up getting ahead.
So on the other side of the ball, you've got Haskins, who has looked pretty strong this year, and we do think that it brings another dimension to this offense that was missing and lacking with JT Barrett. The example for the Ohio State fans that are listening now, if they didn't catch the other previews we've done for Ohio State this year, we liken JT Barrett to Jalen Hurts. And just to give you another layer of depth to that, Alabama beat A&M. I can't even remember the score now. It's like 45-21, 23, something like that. They had 45 points through the third quarter. They could have won that game 60-20 if they wanted to. But if Jalen Hurts is playing in that game this year, it's a 4 to 7 point game win possibly for Alabama, and that's how the last two games against him have played out. So that's what you had with JT Barrett was a lot of offensive struggles that if you had a throwing quarterback in there, I think it completely changes the game. So, but on this side of the ball for Ohio State, you've got a guy that, yes, he came in off the bullpen, out of the bullpen for them at Michigan last year against a, let's be honest, inferior opponent. But this is really his first big road test. And I know he played in Dallas, and I know it was a favorable crowd for TCU, but playing a neutral site game where you've got at least 35%, if not 40, something like that, representation there, to playing on the road at Beaver Stadium at night, I think is a little different. So if we're going to talk about emotions that are maybe a negative for Trace McSorley, I think we also need to explore how this could potentially impact Haskins since it's his first big start. And again, I hate it because we can't tie any data to it, but I think it's worth exploring.
Well, first I have to point out when you called Michigan an inferior opponent, it's going to make fans of both these teams probably pretty happy and rouse some other people up. But the point there that Daniel sort of harped on is Michigan last year when facing top 50 offenses gave up, what was it, an average of 37 points a game?
It's 32.5 points a game against top 50 offenses, and they only faced 3.
Right. So there were a lot of signs there that Michigan, and I think we're seeing it this year off and on, that their defense was bend but don't break, and if you were good enough, you could make them break. It's just not.
It was It wasn't elite. It was
Right. So with Haskins, getting back on topic, I think he's very good, and I'm not going to rehash things too much because a lot of Ohio State fans have already heard this video, but I'm going to sort of compare it with McSorley. It's the same comparison we've made, I think, with Alabama and Ole Miss recently.
Y'all, I gotta give him a little bit of a hard time because we reviewed. I think we talked about this in our live show where I said, yeah, I thought Haskins looked really good against TCU, and y'all, Josh said, well, it wasn't like Baker Mayfield last year, and I was like, so that's your standard, is to be good, you have to be a Heisman-winning #1 overall draft pick. Continue.
Okay, all right, giving me a hard time in a video where nobody had to be angry with me yet. I see how it is. I'll get to that point in a second, but the standards aside, you have different ways of running offenses. So if and that's why I said the Ole Miss Alabama example, because that was the big battle was Chad Kelly versus Jalen Hurts. And the thing with that was Jalen Hurts in that sort of run spread offense, and I know Ohio State fans have already heard this, is really good against teams that are inferior and really struggles against teams that are good. And as the talent level increases and gaps change and everything sort of modifies, it has an effect on the efficiency and effectiveness of that offense. And it's something that I'm kind of critical of in a lot of scoring systems. We were talking beforehand. Looks like S&P just pulled all their live statistics, and I don't know if it's error or not, but we can't talk about them on air right now. But as much as I love S&P and a lot of rating systems, those rating systems are based off comparing your team to, an average Power 5 team or a top 25 team, and they give one rating, right? So they say, for example, in S&P, they have Ohio State, I think, at 31 points over an average opponent, and Alabama's at 35, et cetera. So it's how many points you'd be favored over, I forget the school, but it's basically something like Akron. Well, however many points you're going to be favored over Akron is not the same as however many you're going to be favored over, say, Clemson. And what's a much bigger deal, I think, is if you're Baker Mayfield in Oklahoma, the fact that you could put 40 on Akron, the thing that makes you special is that you can also put 30 on or 40 on Georgia in a way that Jalen Hurts couldn't do. So when Alabama played Ole Miss threw the ball down the yard a lot. And I think in some ways, in terms of aggressiveness, there's some similarities to Penn State and how they use McSorley. Ole Miss would lose some games they really shouldn't have lost, and they would be up and down, but they could score on anyone in the conference, including Alabama, because of the shots they took. Alabama with Jalen Hurts was consistent, and because Ole Miss was bad defensively, they would score a lot of points on Ole Miss. But in bigger games, you could kind of slow down or shut down Alabama. And what I'm basically getting at is if Alabama had played itself, it wouldn't have actually been as effective as Ole Miss was against them because of the style of offense there are. Up until recently, this Ohio State Penn State game would have been pretty similar because you have JT Barrett running in some ways a similar offense to what Hurts ran, and then you have Penn State sort of playing the model of Ole Miss. Same kind of really the same sort of shootout that we saw with Alabama and Ole Miss played out or has played out in this series. But what I think is different this year, and just the same way that Alabama's offense is totally transformed with a thrower, Ohio State's has been the same way. And Haskins has been phenomenal before you give me too much grief about being in any way critical. I mean, he threw 3 incompletions last week. He threw 3 incompletions against Rutgers, though. At this point, let's all be honest and fully understand that Rutgers is one of the very worst teams in college football, bar none.
You're going to take some heat for that.
I know.
They're no cupcake, apparently.
I know, but
that's a nod to you rivals, Ohio State rivals guys who were giving us hell in the forum.
Yeah, a few weeks ago. Yeah, at this point, I think you need to accept the fact that good FCS teams would beat Rutgers, frankly. That's where they are. I mean, it's no fault of anyone other than themselves.
Yeah, and when we say that, same thing with Illinois. That's a terrible team. And I think I mentioned to you when we were watching that game, that's one of the least athletic in terms of a combination of power and speed and size. That's one of the least athletic defenses I've seen in years across college football. When we say this about an Illinois or a Purdue, there are those equivalent teams in other leagues. It's not your fault that you have to play them. Like, it's not a knock on Penn State that they play Illinois or a knock on Ohio State that they play Rutgers. They took care of business. That's all you can say.
Right. And the reason we're bringing it up in this context is Haskins going 20 of 23 against Rutgers. I can't take anything from it. I just can't. It really is the classic case of you can only look bad when you play those teams. And the reason of it is if you're solidly good and you're playing competent football, you're going to annihilate them and have near perfect numbers because they are so terribly bad. And the point being there are Tulane's not a whole lot better, really. So outside that, we have the Oregon State game. It was an opener. We have the TCU game. But even the TCU game was good, right? 24 of 38 is 63% passing. Threw for over 9 yards per attempt, 344 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. He only has 1 INT on the year. The curiosity is how does this translate? And the thing that I was critical of in the TCU game was really, I felt like when pressured, he held on to the ball too long. He still has a little bit of a twinge, and it's unsurprising because it was his 3rd start in college football. He's not quite processing things as fast as he's going to need to. He needs to speed up to the speed of the game. The tools were all there. It's not like I'm criticizing the kid to say he's not a good quarterback. He just looks like a guy that was in his 3rd start of college football, which is pretty darn normal.
Don't you also want to see a little more in terms of points on the board relative to that much offensive production from both on the ground and in the air, and that with that Ohio State team? Yes, they got some love from defensive scores, but don't you want to see for all those numbers a little more points?
Well, I think you do, right? And again, I think some of that is a little bit a byproduct of Meyer's offense. Meyer's offense is very good at moving the ball. It moves the ball, it gets first downs, it gets drives, it puts up a lot of offensive numbers. It does not always translate into a ton of points. And The shutout they had against Clemson, they moved the ball in a lot of that game. They just couldn't put any points in the board. And I think it's typical of spread offenses. It's something we've been very critical of Auburn on this show because Auburn's offensive statistics and numbers often are not as good as their actual production.
All right, so I think this is another instance where I'm going to give you an opportunity to go sort of below the surface and talk about. So, one of the things that we talk about here a lot is, like I said before, when you play a cupcake, you can't, if they're on your schedule, they're on your schedule, but you have to take care of business. And what we see if we're looking at a Georgia, an Alabama, an Ohio State against, Rutgers and Oregon State, we see these teams, maybe not so much with Alabama because of the way they do their second halves, but we see these teams handling their business up front, and then maybe the backups give up some points, or maybe you've got a mixture of starters or backups, or it's you still got your starters in there, but it's 35-7, and you give up a gotcha touchdown. Does it concern you a little bit that Penn State, they did put up a number, they did kick it into overdrive and 63-24, but does it concern you that they had to get those points late and that it was, let's not even talk about the offense, but let's talk about the fact that they gave up 24 points to a really bad offense? Or is it that they were in that mentality the entire game and they were mentally in that blowout space and they just gave up some points that they shouldn't have?
I think it's tough. I think that one of the big things in that game is the way they gave up points. If you have a long, drawn out game against a good opponent, and especially if you have a young defense, you're going to occasionally give up points on big plays or on drives the other team has hits on something, has a good scripted drive, linemen get rotated, etc. Or let's say your star defensive end gets knocked out of the game with an injury. That has an effect. So I'm a little cautious about trying to take too much from it because TCU is a good football team. Now, I don't know if they're a great football team, and that Texas TCU game should be very concerning and we're talking about a forward-looking predictive aspect for Ohio State. It is concerning because now all of a sudden a data point that we thought validated Ohio State was more or less matched by Texas, and we're pretty sure Texas is not a good football team.
And good, we mean playoff contender. Like right now,
Right.
we're talking about Ohio State as a playoff contender. So when you're not playing other playoff contenders, we got to see you mash them.
Right. So, I mean, Ellinger going 22 of 32 for 255 yards and 2 TDs. Not ridiculously far off from pace from Haskins. That makes you sort of step back and have to kind of be careful about what comparisons you want to draw. Similarly, the point production, TCU had a harder time moving the ball in Texas than they did Ohio State. And I think it may be true that Texas may actually have a pretty good defense and have issues in other areas. Or maybe it's a matchup issue where Ohio State was having issues with TCU speed. But then that again that should be a bit of a red flag. That's a weakness. And then maybe Penn State's smaller, quicker receivers are more apt to be able to deal with that. It's all stuff that kind of comes into play when you're trying to evaluate two teams.
All right, so we could talk about this all day, all these hypotheticals all day. Let's talk about a computer-driven hypothetical. What does the model say? And I'm just going to give you an opportunity to tee it up for 30 seconds, remind everybody that we've done a video on it, and then let the model breathe a little bit and tell us what you see there.
Right. So the 30-second version, again, we have a video on it, is that we look at sort of yard per play output for each team, how they did against their opponents, how their opponents did against the two teams in this matchup, and we kind of build a model on what each team looks like, where you're good at offensively, defensively, from a relationship perspective in terms of matchups. And then based off that, we try to say, what's the offensive production that Ohio State will have and Penn State will have in the game? What does it look like? And then based off that offensive production, we go back and the way I have it designed is the model builds a custom multivariate curve, honestly, where each team, we're plotting on your own history what the scoring looks like based off that offensive production. So if we know that you need a lot of yardage in a certain way to score, you may have a lot of yardage projected in the game, but you may not score a lot. And on the other side, maybe another team can score without so much yardage. Maybe some of that factors in turnovers and other issues. That all kind of comes into play. But the point being, the scoring model for each team is actually custom built for each team based off your own historic data. I don't have any man-made variables. This is just purely what the numbers in my model look like that I run every week with as little input from me as possible to try to use it as a base point. Now, with that said, this is a week where it's going to be a little interesting because there's two things that stand out. One, Ohio State, in terms of rush defense and pass defense, is not as good as I might have expected from our model's perspective. One of the intermediate stats I produce working on the model, and this is a straight neutral stat, is percentage of opponent averages you allow. So, in other words, whatever your opponents have averaged on the season, what percent of that average have you allowed in the game? We generally only deal with Power 5 teams that are ranked on this show. So we almost always see numbers under 100%. If you're a good Power 5 team, it should always be under 100% because there's always garbage teams in the schedule that are boosting other teams' offensive numbers up. And looking at that, Ohio State's rush defense is allowing 87% of opponent averages, and the pass defense is averaging 101% of opponent averages. So those are not great numbers. Now, you really need to be under 90% in rush defense to be good. Elite rush defenses are usually more around the 60% mark. They can get very, very low. It's much harder to do that with pass defense. This is why it's hardest. Vertical passing games are better against elite teams. It's very rare for us to ever see a pass defense that drops that number low, but 101% is bad, frankly. That's you're worse than average for what your opponents have. Now, there's a huge caveat here, and that caveat is they've played Oregon State, Rutgers, Tulane, and TCU. Of those teams, they are so bad that it's very difficult for Ohio State to prove themselves. We usually see this with rushing defenses, that really, really good rush defenses tend to have a hard time differentiating themselves early in the year. Every year to start the season, Ohio State and Alabama and Georgia and Clemson's rush defenses don't have a fantastic rush defense number, and it's because they play FCS teams or crappy FBS teams that only average 3 yards per carry anyway. So they hold the team to 2.8 yards per carry, and they're still only holding teams to 90% of their average because they can't run the ball in any other game anyway. Pass defense is a little more unusual, but that 101%, it's concerning. Again, it's only 6.6 yards per attempt allowed. That's enough to be competent by most teams, but I think the trick here is that the teams they've played only average 6.5 yards per attempt. A lot of that's being driven down hard by Rutgers' passing average. 4.4 yards per attempt on the season by Rutgers is putrid. That's a get shut out margin in a single game, and that's their season average. And then there's some other weirdness. Tulane's average at 7.8 yards per attempt. Sounds good, but they don't throw the ball a whole lot. So if you look at how Ohio State did against Tulane in the last game, as far as our model's concerned, they struggled a little bit with a passing game just because of the way it's built, because it's based on a yards per attempt system. We're trying to take volume out of the metric, right? Just because somebody threw the ball 40 times on you doesn't mean your pass defense is bad. But here it kind of bites you because Tulane only threw 14 passes with the starting quarterback. So yeah, they averaged 10 yards per attempt, but they did it on 14 passes, and whereas they ran the ball 42 times. So yeah, you can give up 10 yards per attempt when the other team isn't willing to throw. It's kind of the Georgia Tech problem. So there's a lot of weirdness there, but it's still not a great mark from Ohio State. Anyway,
and we had some of this too last year, where at the start of the season it was really hard to model Alabama because their opponents were so bad that even if you're a dominant team, as you approach zero on any one of these metrics, it's that much harder to be dominant. If a team, for example, is so bad in rushing that they only rush for 1 yard a carry, you could be the most dominant defense in the history of football and still give up 100% of their averages and still dominate, but you don't show that gap. So that's why it's so hard when you play poor competition to draw anything out of the numbers.
Exactly. And I haven't seen anything that's really concerning with Ohio State. The thing I just want to flag with this is nothing that they've produced to date is outside of expectations for a team playing their opponents. As weird as that is to say, Oregon State, Rutgers, TCU, and Tulane have all been right at their season averages collectively when playing Ohio State. What success Ohio State has had in pass defense has been completely reflective of the quality of passing offenses they've played to date. And like you said, it may be a fact that they haven't had a chance to prove themselves, but it's a serious red flag that, again, the neutral statistic that one of my model throws out is giving me. Now, Penn State is the weird one. And the reason for that is Penn State's defensive statistics are significantly better than Ohio State's to this point in the year. 77% of rushing averages allowed, 76% of opponent passing averages allowed. Those are both good numbers. Against the run, that's very good. Against the pass, 76% is elite. Here's my caveat, and it's a huge one. Those numbers include the average from Appalachian State. Appalachian State on the season is averaging 6 yards per carry and 11 yards per attempt. And my model is saying that Penn State looks really good because it held Appalachian State, included with all the other statistics below their average. The problem with that is Appalachian State had a game canceled due to a hurricane.
And an FCS game.
And they also had an FCS game. So Appalachian State's entire season consists of Penn State, Charlotte, and Gardner-Webb.
And we don't include FCS in the model.
Right. So the statistics for Appalachian State are almost completely meaningless. And they're so bad that I was looking at it and I was just kind of playing with the numbers. So if I drop Appalachian State's season average down and I say, well, what happens if they get right at what Penn State's allowing? All of a sudden, these numbers change dramatically. Penn State's rush average allowed is exactly the same at Ohio State at 86%. And all of a sudden, Penn State's giving up 104% of opponent passing averages. So that's how much of an impact on the statistic that Appalachian State's having. Now, all that said, how does the modal look in terms of score? Maybe I should have started with this. And I think in future videos, we'll probably get to the point a little sooner. We've just been a little too nerdy in getting into the numbers with you guys. So if you hate it, let us know in the comments. But we're just enjoying talking about it. Ohio State in this game is favored to lose, and it's due to the sort of effectiveness of Penn State's defense on paper, and it's due to the ability for Penn State to score with production. And it's pretty significant. The model spits out Penn State 52, Ohio State 32. Penn State is expected to outgain yard per play, 6.7 yards per play for Penn State to 6 to Ohio State. So that's my initial neutral model. Again, hands off, same model we do every year. And then I'll give you another caveat with that, which is what happens if I play with the numbers the way I just suggested. If I drop Appalachian State and let's pretend their season average is exactly what Penn State's allowing. If I do that, and all of a sudden where the defensive numbers shift, where Penn State's suddenly a little worse than Ohio State defensively, then the model actually suggests that Ohio State wins 56-52. So sort of two numbers there I gave you. One, looking at the Appalachian State schedule straight up. When you only have 4 data points, Appalachian State is a really big factor, probably unduly so. And that's 52-32. 32 points is a lot to give up. But without that, all of a sudden you end up in a 56-52 shootout with Ohio State winning.
And it's interesting to me because we talked about yards per play there, but even looking at the teams that Penn State has played, App State scored 38 against Penn State, 45 against Charlotte. I said earlier when we were talking, I think it was in the Ohio State preview, I said I'm not killing Penn State for that game. It's the opening game of the season. You have all offseason to prepare for the team. They were obviously up for that game, and I don't know that App State's a bad football team. So I'm not killing them like a lot of people were for 45-38. I am a little concerned, as like we talked before, with the 24 points to Illinois. That worries me a little bit. It's 24 points early to a really bad offense. Their offense is basic. Their quarterback is below average. I watched that whole game. I did not come away impressed. Pitt, whatever. Kent State. It's another one that's hard to draw from the defensive numbers. They scored 10 points against against Penn State. They scored 17 this weekend against Ole Miss, and Ole Miss is probably the worst defense in the history of college football. So there's a lot that's really tough here from the numbers. I think even before we get into our picks, I think the model is showing something that's interesting in that it's expecting a lot of points. And it's pulling out a lot of, I think, markers from defensive numbers that I think a lot of the national media might be glossing over. They might be saying, yeah, these guys are struggling a little on defense. The model's saying, no, these guys are struggling really bad on defense. And for those of y'all that are looking at this model and rolling your eyes a little bit, last year in this game, now it did not pick the right winner, but our model in this game last year, the score was 31-33 Penn State. And the final score was 39-38 Ohio State. So it was a couple of points off the final margin, which to me, I mean, it nailed them pretty good. I think the model started out 15-0-2 last year. But early in the year, because of things you said, like with App State's having a game canceled, playing an FCS team, with limited data, there's an opportunity for it to throw the model off. And this is why we don't start the model until week 4. But I do think, and this is what we do, just like last week, Alabama 57-2, I think the model
52-7 Alabama over A&M last week, yeah.
Yeah. So it was a little wacky, but it could have almost been that bad in terms of margin if they wanted it. So as crazy as I think that first number is, once you drop the App State numbers, then you see close game shootout. Is that kind of tracking with what you think?
It does, and he threw out the model last year, and I think Ohio State fans, maybe we got a little bit of respect because the TCU model was pretty good this year. But last year, going into that Ohio State Penn State game, I think the expectation was for a bit of a struggling game. You know, both teams are really good, but the defenses are being talked up. And everybody's saying it was a close fought game and 24-27, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if I remember right, my prediction of that game was dead on. I think Penn State had a chance maybe to kick a field goal at the end of the game. And if they'd done that, I think I would have had the score exactly. I'm pretty sure that's how that played out.
Yeah, it was.
But yeah, and so if Penn State had kicked a field goal at the end of the game, I would have actually gotten the exact score. And we took a lot of, I say heat, or people were really skeptical in the comments that we were predicting a 40-point on each side game, that there's no way teams give up. Both teams, no way our defense is going to give up. The other team, no way our defense is going to give up. What we're saying is like, look, last year Ohio State had issues with pass defense against really good teams, and Penn State's defense just wasn't great against elite teams. Both offenses were really, really good. It needed to be a high-scoring game. That's ended up being what's happening. What our model is saying this year is whatever happened last year with the defenses struggling to keep up with the very, very, very good offenses in the game. Again, really more of an indication of how good the offenses were. This year, it's saying it's even more so. I think that makes sense. I think it tracks with the numbers. I do find it really interesting that marker, if you want to say red flag it's throwing up, that Ohio State's pass defense may be a very carefully hidden weakness that has been hidden because none of the teams they've played have been very good passing teams. And there was a time, again, a couple weeks ago, we would have said TCU was that test, and now all of a sudden TCU probably isn't. 6.8 yards per attempt against Texas, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. It may well be that both these teams have real issues in pass defense. We know Haskins is a very good quarterback. We know McSorley is a very good quarterback. And I think it makes good sense that this could be a shootout by two elite quarterbacks and an elite at the, playoff Heisman level, NFL kind of quarterback level. Both guys ending up being a shootout where their offenses are ahead of the defenses in this game.
All right. So go ahead and give me your pick.
My pick for this game is Ohio State. I'm going against the model. I think the numbers without App State are a lot more accurate. I think we talk about a lot of what the show is not telling you the numbers. It's telling you where the numbers lie to you. In this case, the Appalachian State numbers are really messing with my model. This is why we don't run the model with 3 weeks of data, because it does stuff like this. It just so happens that with the hurricane, we only have 2 weeks of data for Appalachian State, and it's kind of screwing up everything. I think it is going to be a very high scoring game. A game in the 50s seems too high. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I do think it will be high scoring. I'm going to go with Ohio State 45, uh, Penn State 35. And I think the defining factor to me is I think Penn State's receiving core, like I talked about, doesn't have the guys to run the intermediate to deep passing game they need to be successful as they want to be in this game. And they're not going to be able to stretch the field vertically the way they'd like with those guys on the field. And because of that, I think they have a hard time keeping pace with an Ohio State offense that's at some point here should start really being able to click. Now, that's with the huge caveat that we're going to have to see how Haskins handles the environment, because that is a very big deal. Quarterbacks very frequently struggle when they encounter their first hostile road environment.
I don't hate your pick. I think it's a little closer than that. I really like this Penn State team, and I love Trace McSorley. The issue for me is that running back. I don't think they're where Ohio State is. And what scares me about Penn State, they gave up 245 yards on the ground to Pittsburgh. And I know they blew them out, but again, it's another one where they scored 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. And it was 14-6 at the half. So they're doing this backside blowout thing that they're not really doing, it's not like what we've seen from Ohio State, from Alabama. So I think Penn State is a great team. I don't know that they're as good as Ohio State, which has me picking Ohio State. I got 42-37 Ohio State. I can't get past the fact that I think a lot of Ohio State's issues, and 37 points is still a lot of points, but I think this is a great offense. And I think that what we've seen is when Penn State needs to turn it on, they can. And I think the winner of this game is a lock for the playoffs, because we see the rest of the college football world kind of crumbling around the few elite teams that are standing. And I think that the winner of this game, even if they stub their toe somewhere else down the line, is going to win the division. And we see that a Wisconsin or an Iowa they're going to face is not going to be that big of a challenge. So 42-37 for me. If this game is not a shootout, if this game is in 21-24 type score or 20-17 type score, does that favor Ohio State or does that favor Penn State?
It's an interesting question. I think if it's a low scoring game, it honestly probably favors Penn State. And the reason I say that is I think Penn State's offense is more predicated on the big play, and they're going to score some points off what you could call cheap plays. And there's signs that Ohio State will give some points up on some cheap plays. So if it's a close, low scoring game, I think Penn State has an edge because they can sort of basically, they can produce points that their yardage doesn't justify. We talk about sometimes efficiency or different offenses. Some offenses need a lot of yards, and Ohio State's one that usually needs a lot of yards just before they start really scoring points, and then it starts ramping up dramatically again. And that's why it does better with, especially when they had JT Barrett, did better against bad opponents, that once they start crossing yardage thresholds, all of a sudden scoring goes up exponentially. But they don't score a ton if they have really under 350 yards offense. They struggle to score. Penn State will score with under 350 yards of offense because they'll hit those big chunk plays. And that, I think, gives them an edge in a close, low-scoring game.
If you want to pick one of the games for Penn State this year that scares you in terms of maybe what's leading you to this decision where you've got Ohio State beating them by 10, which game, which performance is that indicator? Or is it just that you think Ohio State is that good and it's not saying anything bad about Penn State, it's just saying everything good about Ohio State?
I'm probably with you in that I take more from the Illinois game than I do the Appalachian State game. There are signs that Appalachian State is a really good team. I think they're creeping around, close to the top 25 level in S&P. Again, very little data. There's a real chance that Appalachian State's a good team. We don't have enough to prove that either way. 38 points is a concern, but I don't know if that means anything or not. Sometimes that they're a really good program. I do know that Illinois is not a great team. And I know that, 24 points may not seem like a ton, but again, they weren't that successful against some other teams that we know aren't great. And again, the fact that they did it in 3 quarters and then truly just fell flat on their face, where everything went wrong in the 4th quarter, that's what gives me real concern. I haven't seen Ohio State legitimately struggle for multiple quarters to where I thought they would lose a ball game. I've seen some stuff go wrong, like the TCU game where it was kind of close, but they always felt like in control. Penn State did not look like they were in control of that Illinois game. And if breaks had gone the other way, it would not have shocked me if Illinois would have won that game. So as much as Penn State won by a large margin, that game was not in any way that one-sided. That's what gives me pause.
All right, real quick, because we're super long on this one. If Ohio State wins, who's the MVP? If Penn State wins, who's the MVP?
It's the quarterbacks for either team. And I'd be really surprised if it's anything otherwise. Everything our model suggests 2 things, which is one, it's unrealistic for either fans of either team to think they're probably going to dominate this game. There's a lot of statistics that show these teams are going to be high scoring. This is going to be a shootout between 2 good teams. I think probably more than likely the 2 best teams in the Big Ten, probably by a significant margin. Obviously the rankings hold that up, but I think it's actually true. But it also says, again, the weakness is in pass defense. If there's a red flag for either team, both teams have a very good quarterback. I have a hard time believing that the team that wins this game doesn't have a quarterback with a very successful night.
I got Ohio State, you got Ohio State, and I think what we saw with TCU, and we've seen this with Alabama, we've seen it with Georgia, teams that are the underdogs in these games, in these huge games, find out. A lot of them win, but a lot of them lose, and what they find out is games against teams with elite talent are really, really long. TCU found that out. They were blow for blow with Ohio State for a while, but they found out that these games become really long, really fast. All right, y'all, that's it for us this week for our one of 2 out-of-conference games. It was really long. We had a lot to discuss, and it was our first opportunity to talk about Penn State this year. Penn State fans, don't hate us for picking against your team. We love you. We talk your team up all the time. We do use your team and Ohio State as benchmarks in some of our other SEC discussions. Who knows? This game, I'm picking it pretty close. It could go either way. We back our points up with data. We ask you to do the same in the comments. Let us know who's your MVP. Give us your score predictions. Don't just tell us we're dumb. Tell us why we're dumb and back it up with data, and we will certainly engage you with the comments, and we'll probably find you on the internet, on your home forums, and talk you up there too. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.